Picture this: you're in a room full of military officers, and someone walks in wearing civilian clothes. No uniform, no visible rank, just a quiet confidence that most people mistake for arrogance. What happens next will either humble you or teach you the most important lesson about respect you'll ever learn. This is the true story of Captain James Morrison, a decorated Marine officer who thought he knew everything about authority, chain of command, and respect. He was about to discover that real power doesn't always come with visible stripes, and sometimes the most dangerous assumption you can make is thinking you know who's really in charge. What started as a routine military briefing in a conference room at Camp Pendleton became a career-defining moment that would change how an entire room of officers viewed authority, respect, and the true meaning of leadership. The woman who walked into that room that day carried no visible rank, wore no uniform, and spoke with a calm voice that barely rose above a whisper. But she was about to demonstrate a level of authority that would leave the seasoned Marine captain speechless, embarrassed, and forever changed. This is that story. Captain James Morrison had always been particular about protocol. 23 years in the Marine Corps had taught him that respect wasn't just earned through battlefield heroics or years of service. It was also communicated through the proper display of rank, the crispness of a uniform, and the adherence to military customs and courtesies that had been drilled into him since his days at Paris Island. On that Tuesday morning in September, Morrison arrived at Building 1043 at Camp Pendleton 30 minutes early, just as he always did. The briefing room was already buzzing with activity as various officers filtered in, their dress blue uniforms pressed to perfection, ribbons and medals catching the fluorescent light overhead. Morrison took his usual seat near the front, close enough to demonstrate his engagement but not so close as to appear overeager. The meeting was supposed to be routine. A quarterly review of operational readiness across several Marine expeditionary units, with representatives from various commands throughout Southern California. Morrison had attended dozens of these briefings over the years, and they typically followed the same predictable pattern: PowerPoint presentations, status updates, questions from senior officers, and the inevitable discussion about resource allocation and training schedules. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the meeting coordinator, stood at the front of the room checking her notes one final time. Morrison had worked with Hayes on several occasions and found her to be competent, if a bit too focused on what he considered administrative details rather than the tactical realities of military operations. She was the type of officer who worried about paperwork deadlines and compliance reports, while Marines like Morrison focused on combat readiness and mission effectiveness. The room gradually filled with familiar faces. Major Tom Rodriguez from the 1st Marine Logistics Group nodded at Morrison from across the room. Colonel Michael Stevens, a gruff infantry officer Morrison had served with in Afghanistan, took a seat in the back row, his weathered face already showing signs of the impatience that would likely surface if the briefing ran long. Captain Sarah Chen from the Intelligence Division was reviewing a thick folder of documents, her attention completely absorbed by whatever classified material she was preparing to present. Morrison glanced at his watch: 0755 hours. 5 minutes until the scheduled start time, which meant the briefing would actually begin around 0800, after everyone had settled in and Hayes had gone through her usual preliminary remarks about the agenda and ground rules. Military punctuality was a source of pride for Morrison, but he had learned to account for the reality that even the most disciplined organizations had their share of administrative overhead. The conference room itself was unremarkable, a sterile government space with beige walls, standard-issue furniture, and the kind of commercial-grade carpet that had seen better days. A large screen dominated the front wall, connected to a projector that would display the endless succession of slides that constituted most modern military briefings. The American flag stood in one corner, with the Marine Corps flag in the other, both positioned with the mathematical precision that military protocol demanded. Morrison's phone buzzed with a text message from his wife, reminding him about their dinner plans that evening. He quickly typed back a confirmation, then returned his attention to the room as Hayes called for everyone's attention. "Good morning, Marines," Hayes announced, her voice carrying the crisp authority that came with years of addressing rooms full of officers. "Before we begin today's briefing, I want to remind everyone that we have a guest joining us this morning. She'll be observing our procedures as part of an ongoing assessment of operational coordination between different command levels." Morrison barely registered the comment. Guest observers were common at these briefings, usually civilians from the Department of Defense or representatives from contractor organizations that supported various Marine Corps operations. They typically sat quietly in the back, took notes, and asked a few polite questions at the end before disappearing back to wherever they came from. The door at the rear of the conference room opened, and Morrison heard footsteps but didn't bother turning around. Hayes was already launching into her opening remarks about the agenda and the expected duration of each presentation. Morrison opened his leather portfolio and reviewed his own notes, since he would be presenting information about his unit's recent training exercises and readiness status. Captain Morrison's unit, Bravo Company of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, had just completed a successful mountain warfare training exercise at the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, California. The numbers were impressive: 94% completion rate for all training objectives, 0 serious injuries, and ammunition expenditure that came in 12% under budget. These were the kinds of metrics that senior officers appreciated, and Morrison took pride in his ability to deliver results while maintaining strict safety standards. As Hayes continued her introductory comments, Morrison mentally rehearsed the key points of his presentation. The training exercise had been particularly challenging, with temperatures dropping below freezing and weather conditions that tested both equipment and personnel. His Marines had performed exceptionally well, adapting to the harsh environment and demonstrating the kind of flexibility and resilience that defined elite military units. The mountain warfare training had also provided valuable lessons about equipment maintenance in extreme conditions. Morrison's unit had identified several improvements to standard operating procedures that could benefit other Marine units preparing for similar training environments. He was particularly proud of the innovative solutions his Marines had developed for protecting sensitive electronic equipment from moisture and temperature fluctuations. "Our first presenter this morning will be Captain Morrison," Hayes announced, bringing Morrison's attention back to the immediate moment. Captain Morrison will be providing an overview of recent training activities and lessons learned from the mountain warfare exercise conducted last month. Morrison stood and walked to the front of the room, his bearing reflecting the confidence that came from years of successful leadership and operational experience. He had given hundreds of similar presentations over the years, and the format was familiar and comfortable. State the objectives, present the key data, highlight the most important outcomes, and summarize the lessons learned that could benefit other units. As he began setting up his presentation materials, Morrison became aware of movement in his peripheral vision. Someone had entered the room late and was taking a seat near the back. He caught a glimpse of civilian clothing, which immediately triggered his annoyance about the casual attitude that some people brought to military settings. The late arrival was a woman, probably in her 40s, wearing a simple gray business suit and carrying what appeared to be a standard government-issue briefcase. She moved quietly to an empty seat and sat down without any of the courtesies that Morrison expected from people attending military briefings. No greeting to the senior officers in the room, no acknowledgement of the interruption her late arrival had caused, just a casual assumption that she could walk into a Marine Corps briefing whenever she felt like it. Morrison's irritation increased as he observed the woman's demeanor. She wasn't taking notes like most observers, wasn't paying attention to Hayes' continued comments about the meeting agenda, and seemed more interested in examining the other attendees than focusing on the purpose of the briefing. There was something about her attitude that struck Morrison as disrespectful, a civilian casualness that didn't belong in a military environment where protocol and proper behavior were fundamental expectations. The woman's appearance was unremarkable in most respects. Average height, brown hair pulled back in a simple style, no jewelry except for a basic watch, and glasses that suggested someone who spent considerable time reading detailed documents. She could have been any number of Department of Defense contractors or administrative personnel who occasionally attended these briefings as part of their oversight responsibilities. What bothered Morrison most was the sense of entitlement the woman seemed to project. She had settled into her seat as if she owned the place, with no apparent concern for the fact that she had interrupted a formal military briefing attended by officers whose time was valuable and whose schedules were demanding. This was exactly the kind of civilian attitude that frustrated Morrison about the increasing bureaucratization of military operations. Morrison had seen this pattern before: civilians with government positions who thought their job titles gave them the right to treat military personnel as if they were employees of some corporate organization rather than professional warriors responsible for national defense. These people seemed to forget that Marines like Morrison had earned their positions through years of training, deployment, and leadership under combat conditions that most civilians couldn't imagine. As Morrison finished setting up his presentation, he made a mental note to speak with Hayes after the briefing about establishing better protocols for guest observers. Late arrivals should either wait until a natural break in the proceedings or reschedule their visit for a more appropriate time. Allowing civilians to disrupt military briefings sent the wrong message about standards and expectations. The woman finally opened her briefcase and removed a single legal pad, but Morrison noticed that she still wasn't taking notes or paying close attention to the proceedings. Instead, she seemed to be conducting her own quiet assessment of the room and its occupants, making occasional marks on her pad that looked more like a checklist than meeting notes. Morrison cleared his throat and began his presentation, determined to demonstrate the kind of professionalism and competence that he expected from everyone in the room, regardless of their military or civilian status. His slides were well organized, his data was accurate, and his delivery was crisp and confident. This was how things should be done when Marines gathered to discuss important operational matters. "Good morning," Morrison began, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "I'm here to provide an overview of training exercise Mountain Strike, which was conducted by Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, at the Mountain Warfare Training Center from August 15 through August 30. The familiar rhythm of a military briefing settled over the room as Morrison launched into his presentation, but he found himself occasionally glancing toward the back where the civilian woman sat with her enigmatic notepad and her apparent disregard for the importance of what was being discussed. Morrison's presentation proceeded smoothly for the first 15 minutes. He detailed the training objectives, the challenging environmental conditions his Marines had faced, and the impressive performance metrics that demonstrated the exercise's success. The assembled officers asked relevant questions about equipment performance, casualty evacuation procedures, and the applicability of mountain warfare tactics to other operational environments. Throughout his presentation, Morrison maintained his professional demeanor, but he couldn't shake his awareness of the civilian woman in the back row. She had stopped making notes entirely and was now simply observing the proceedings with what Morrison interpreted as a detached, almost bored expression. Her lack of engagement was becoming a distraction that Morrison found increasingly difficult to ignore. When Major Rodriguez asked a detailed question about cold weather equipment maintenance, Morrison noticed that the woman checked her watch and shifted in her seat as if she found the technical discussion tedious. This was exactly the kind of civilian attitude that annoyed Morrison most, someone who attended military briefings but clearly didn't appreciate the complexity and importance of the operational details being discussed. Morrison concluded his presentation with a summary of lessons learned and recommendations for future mountain warfare training. The applause from his fellow officers was polite and professional, and Hayes thanked him for a thorough and informative briefing. As Morrison returned to his seat, he felt satisfied with his performance but irritated by the civilian woman's apparent indifference to what he considered valuable information that could save Marine lives in future operations. Colonel Stevens was the next presenter, and he launched into a detailed analysis of logistics support requirements for forward-deployed Marine units. Stevens had a reputation for being thorough to the point of exhaustion, and his presentations typically included more statistical analysis than most officers found necessary. Morrison settled in for what he knew would be a lengthy technical discussion. During Stevens' presentation, Morrison found himself paying more attention to the civilian woman than to the logistics data being presented. She had resumed taking notes, but her writing seemed sporadic and focused on specific moments rather than the comprehensive documentation that Morrison would have expected from a serious observer. About halfway through Stevens' presentation, the woman did something that pushed Morrison's irritation into genuine annoyance. She answered her cell phone. The phone had been set to vibrate, so the incoming call didn't disrupt the briefing with an audible ring. But the woman glanced at the screen, stood up quietly, and walked to the back corner of the room where she answered the call in a whisper that was just loud enough to be audible to the officers seated nearby. Morrison couldn't make out the specific words, but he could hear the woman's voice as she conducted what appeared to be a business conversation while Colonel Stevens continued his presentation. The call lasted about 3 minutes, during which the woman occasionally glanced toward the front of the room but clearly gave her primary attention to whatever discussion was taking place on the phone. When she finally ended the call and returned to her seat, Morrison had reached the limits of his patience with her unprofessional behavior. Taking personal phone calls during a military briefing was completely unacceptable, regardless of whether the caller was a civilian or military personnel. It demonstrated a fundamental disrespect for the proceedings and the people who were dedicating their time to important operational discussions. Morrison caught the eye of Captain Chen, who was sitting 2 seats away, and saw his own annoyance reflected in her expression. Chen had also noticed the phone call, and her slight shake of the head indicated that she shared Morrison's disapproval of the civilian woman's behavior. As Stevens concluded his presentation and returned to his seat, Morrison made a decision. He had remained silent about the woman's unprofessional conduct long enough. Someone needed to address her behavior before it became even more disruptive, and, as one of the senior captains in the room, Morrison felt it was his responsibility to speak up. Hayes announced a 15-minute break before the next presentation, and the assembled officers began standing and moving around the room. Morrison immediately walked toward the back of the room where the civilian woman was closing her briefcase and preparing to leave her seat. "Excuse me," Morrison said, his voice carrying the tone of authority that 23 years of military leadership had ingrained in him. "I need to speak with you about your conduct during this briefing." The woman looked up at Morrison with an expression that seemed more curious than concerned. She was shorter than Morrison had realized, probably about 5 feet 6 inches, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that would make her blend into any government office building in Washington. But there was something about her eyes that suggested she was more alert and observant than her casual demeanor indicated. "Is there a problem, Captain?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. Morrison was momentarily taken aback by her directness. Most civilians, when confronted by a Marine officer about inappropriate behavior, showed at least some awareness that they had violated proper protocol. This woman seemed genuinely puzzled by Morrison's approach, as if she couldn't understand what issue he might have with her conduct. "Yes, there is a problem," Morrison replied, lowering his voice but maintaining the firm tone that he used when correcting inappropriate behavior. "You arrived late to this briefing without any acknowledgement or apology. You've been inattentive throughout the presentations, and you took a personal phone call in the middle of Colonel Stevens' briefing. This is a professional military setting, and we expect all attendees to conduct themselves accordingly." The woman nodded slowly as Morrison spoke, but her expression didn't show the embarrassment or contrition that he expected. Instead, she seemed to be processing his comments with the kind of analytical attention that suggested she was evaluating his words rather than accepting his criticism. "I see," she said when Morrison finished. "And you are?" Morrison straightened his shoulders and replied with the crisp precision that he used for formal introductions. "Captain James Morrison, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines." "And you are?" The woman extended her hand in a gesture that seemed more businesslike than apologetic. "Dr. Elizabeth Reeves." Morrison shook her hand briefly, noting that her grip was firm and confident, but he wasn't satisfied with such a minimal introduction. Civilian attendees at military briefings were typically introduced by the meeting coordinator and their purpose for attending was explained to the assembled officers. Dr. Reeves, Morrison continued, "I don't believe Lieutenant Colonel Hayes properly introduced you or explained your role here today. What organization are you representing?" Dr. Reeves seemed to consider the question for a moment before responding. "I'm here in an oversight capacity, Captain Morrison. I appreciate your concern about protocol, but I can assure you that my presence and conduct have been properly authorized." Morrison found her response frustratingly vague. Oversight could mean anything from a routine administrative review to an inspector general investigation. The fact that she wasn't being more specific suggested that either she didn't understand the importance of transparency in military settings, or she was deliberately being evasive about her purpose. "With respect, Dr. Reeves, that doesn't address the issue of your unprofessional conduct during the briefing," Morrison said. "Taking personal phone calls during a military presentation is completely inappropriate, regardless of your authorization to be here." Dr. Reeves tilted her head slightly, a gesture that reminded Morrison of someone trying to solve a particularly interesting puzzle. "That wasn't a personal call, Captain Morrison." "Business call, personal call, it doesn't matter," Morrison replied, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to maintain a professional tone. "Interrupting a military briefing to conduct phone conversations is unacceptable behavior." Around them, other officers were beginning to notice the conversation. Morrison was aware of Major Rodriguez watching from across the room, and he could see Captain Chen pausing in her conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes to glance in their direction. The attention bothered Morrison because he preferred to handle disciplinary matters privately, but Dr. Reeves' casual dismissal of his concerns was forcing him to be more direct than he would normally choose to be in a public setting. "Captain Morrison," Dr. Reeves said, her voice remaining calm despite Morrison's obvious irritation, "I understand your concern about proper protocol. However, I think there may be some confusion about the nature of my presence here today." Morrison felt his patience running out entirely. This woman seemed determined to deflect every attempt he made to address her inappropriate behavior. She was responding to his legitimate concerns about military protocol with the kind of bureaucratic double-talk that he associated with the worst aspects of dealing with civilian oversight organizations. "There's no confusion on my part, Dr. Reeves," Morrison said, his voice now loud enough to carry clearly across the room. I saw you arrive late, I watched you ignore the presentations, and I observed you taking a phone call during Colonel Stevens' briefing. Those behaviors are unprofessional and disrespectful in any setting, but they're particularly inappropriate in a military environment." The conversation in the room had stopped entirely now. Every officer in the room was watching the exchange between Morrison and Dr. Reeves, and Morrison could feel the weight of their attention. He realized that he was now committed to seeing this confrontation through to its conclusion, regardless of how uncomfortable the public nature of the discussion had become. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had begun walking toward them, her expression showing the kind of concern that suggested she recognized the potential for this situation to escalate beyond appropriate bounds. Morrison saw her approach but felt that he needed to finish making his point about proper conduct and respect for military settings. Furthermore, Morrison continued, directing his comments as much to the assembled officers as to Dr. Reeves, "If civilian observers can't be expected to conduct themselves professionally during our briefings, then perhaps we need to reconsider our policies about allowing outside personnel to attend these meetings." Dr. Reeves listened to Morrison's expanded criticism with the same calm attention she had shown throughout their conversation. When he finished, she nodded once and said, "Captain Morrison, you've made your position very clear. Now, if I may, I'd like to clarify a few things about my position." Morrison gestured for her to proceed, confident that whatever explanation she offered would not justify the unprofessional behavior he had observed. He had given her multiple opportunities to apologize or explain herself, and she had consistently chosen to deflect his concerns rather than acknowledge her inappropriate conduct. The room had become completely silent now, with every officer focused on the confrontation that had developed between the Marine captain and the civilian observer. Morrison was aware that this situation had moved beyond a simple discussion of protocol and had become something that would likely be remembered and discussed long after the briefing concluded. Dr. Reeves reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a black leather credential case. The movement was deliberate and unhurried, as if she were taking care to ensure that Morrison and the other officers in the room could clearly observe what she was doing. She opened the case and held it out toward Morrison, positioning it so that the assembled officers could see its contents. Morrison glanced down at the credentials and felt his stomach drop. The official seal was immediately recognizable, the Department of Defense, Office of the Inspector General. But it was the text below the seal that made Morrison's confident expression begin to fade. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves was not just any civilian observer attending a routine briefing. She was a senior investigator with the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General, with authority that extended far beyond anything Morrison had imagined when he decided to confront her about protocol violations. The credentials were unmistakably authentic, with the kind of security features and official formatting that Morrison had seen often enough to recognize immediately. Dr. Reeves was not a contractor or administrative personnel or even a mid-level DoD civilian. She was a senior investigator with the authority to examine military operations, interview personnel, and make recommendations that could affect careers, budgets, and entire command structures. Morrison stared at the credentials for several seconds, his mind racing as he tried to process the implications of what he was seeing. The Inspector General's office was responsible for investigating fraud, waste, abuse, and misconduct within the Department of Defense. When IG investigators attended military briefings, it was rarely for routine observation purposes. "Dr. Reeves," Morrison said, his voice noticeably quieter than it had been moments earlier. I wasn't aware of your specific position. Dr. Reeves closed the credential case and returned it to her pocket. Her expression remained neutral, showing neither satisfaction at Morrison's obvious discomfort nor annoyance at his previous confrontational behavior. "I understand, Captain Morrison. However, I should point out that my position doesn't change the validity of your concerns about protocol and professional conduct." The admission surprised Morrison. He had expected Dr. Reeves to use her revealed authority to put him in his place, perhaps even to threaten some form of disciplinary action for his public confrontation of an IG investigator. Instead, she seemed to be acknowledging that his concerns about proper behavior during military briefings were legitimate, even if his assumptions about her role and authority had been completely wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes reached them at that moment, her face showing a mixture of concern and embarrassment that suggested she was well aware of how the situation had developed. "Captain Morrison, Dr. Reeves, is there anything I can help clarify here?" Morrison looked from Hayes to Dr. Reeves, realizing that his position had become significantly more complicated than he had anticipated. He had just spent several minutes publicly criticizing a senior inspector general investigator for behavior that, given her position and authority, might have been entirely appropriate under circumstances that Morrison didn't understand. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Dr. Reeves said, Captain Morrison was expressing concern about my conduct during the briefing. Specifically, my late arrival, my apparent inattention during the presentations, and my phone call during Colonel Stevens' presentation. Hayes' expression showed immediate understanding of the delicate nature of the situation. Morrison could see her mental calculation of the potential consequences of one of her officers having confronted an IG investigator in front of a room full of witnesses. The Inspector General's office had the authority to make life very difficult for military officers who interfered with their investigations or showed disrespect for their personnel. Dr. Reeves, Hayes said carefully, I hope Captain Morrison's comments haven't been taken as any form of interference with your work here today. Dr. Reeves shook her head. Not at all, Lieutenant Colonel. In fact, Captain Morrison's concerns raised some interesting questions about communication and expectations that I think deserve discussion. Morrison felt a growing sense of dread as he realized that his confrontation with Dr. Reeves might have inadvertently drawn attention to issues that the IG investigator found significant. His attempt to address what he saw as unprofessional behavior had somehow evolved into a situation where his own conduct and judgment were likely to face scrutiny. The other officers in the room maintained their positions, clearly understanding that they were witnessing something that went beyond a routine disagreement about protocol. Major Rodriguez had moved closer to the group, and Colonel Stevens was watching the exchange with the kind of intense attention that suggested he recognized the potential ramifications of the situation. Captain Morrison, Dr. Reeves continued, you mentioned that you weren't properly informed about my role here today. Is that correct? Morrison glanced at Lieutenant Colonel Hayes before responding. The question seemed straightforward, but, given Dr. Reeves' position, he suspected that his answer might have implications that extended beyond simple courtesy or administrative efficiency. That's correct, Dr. Reeves, Morrison replied. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes mentioned that we had a guest observer, but she didn't specify your organization or the purpose of your visit. Dr. Reeves nodded and made a note on her legal pad. Morrison realized that what he had interpreted as casual note-taking during the briefing might actually have been systematic documentation of the proceedings for investigative purposes. And, based on your understanding of my role as a guest observer, you formed certain expectations about appropriate behavior during the briefing, Dr. Reeves said. Morrison could see the direction of her questions, but he wasn't sure how to respond without either appearing to justify his confrontational behavior or seeming to back down from his principles about proper conduct in military settings. Yes, ma'am, Morrison said. I believe that all attendees, regardless of their civilian or military status, should conduct themselves professionally during official briefings. Dr. Reeves made another note. And, when my behavior didn't meet those expectations, you felt it was appropriate to confront me directly. Morrison hesitated, realizing that his answer could be interpreted as either commendable leadership or inappropriate interference with an IG investigation. The fact that he hadn't known Dr. Reeves' true position might mitigate his error, but it wouldn't eliminate the potential consequences of having publicly challenged someone with her authority. I believed it was important to address what appeared to be unprofessional conduct, Morrison said. Dr. Reeves looked up from her notepad and studied Morrison for a moment. The examination made him uncomfortable, but he maintained eye contact and tried to project the kind of confidence and integrity that had served him well throughout his military career. Captain Morrison, Dr. Reeves said, I want to address the specific behaviors that concerned you. First, my late arrival. I was delayed by a phone call from the Pentagon regarding this investigation. The information I received affected my approach to observing today's briefing. Morrison felt his face flush as he realized that Dr. Reeves' late arrival, which he had interpreted as casual disregard for military protocol, had actually been the result of communication with senior Department of Defense officials about matters that were undoubtedly more important than his unit's mountain warfare training exercise. Second, Dr. Reeves continued, my apparent inattention during the presentations. I was actually conducting a focused assessment of specific aspects of the briefing process, which required different observation techniques than conventional note-taking. Morrison's discomfort increased as Dr. Reeves systematically addressed each of his complaints. What he had seen as unprofessional behavior was actually the methodical work of an experienced investigator conducting official duties that Morrison hadn't understood. Finally, Dr. Reeves said, the phone call during Colonel Stevens' presentation. That was a communication with my supervisor regarding preliminary findings that needed to be reported immediately due to their potential implications for ongoing operations. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was taking notes now, and Morrison realized that the entire conversation was being documented in a way that could become part of an official record. His public confrontation of an IG investigator was being preserved in detail, along with Dr. Reeves' explanations of behavior that Morrison had misinterpreted. The room remained silent as Dr. Reeves finished her explanations. Morrison could feel the weight of attention from his fellow officers, and he suspected that many of them were reassessing their own assumptions about Dr. Reeves' presence and purpose. Dr. Reeves, Morrison said, his voice reflecting a combination of embarrassment and determination to handle the situation with whatever dignity he could salvage, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your role and your conduct without having complete information. Dr. Reeves studied Morrison's face as he spoke, and, for the first time since their conversation began, Morrison thought he detected a slight softening in her expression. Captain Morrison, she replied, your apology is accepted. However, I want to discuss something that I think is more important than individual misunderstandings. Morrison braced himself for what he assumed would be a criticism of his judgment, his leadership, or his understanding of proper military-civilian relations. Instead, Dr. Reeves surprised him with a question that seemed to go to the heart of issues much larger than their personal confrontation. Captain Morrison, in your 23 years of military service, how often have you encountered situations where important information was withheld or inadequately communicated, leading to conflicts or misunderstandings that could have been prevented? Morrison considered Dr. Reeves' question carefully, recognizing that his answer would likely have implications beyond their immediate conversation. The question went to the heart of military operations, leadership effectiveness, and the kind of communication failures that could affect mission success and personnel safety. Dr. Reeves, Morrison said, inadequate communication is one of the most persistent challenges we face in military operations. It affects everything from tactical coordination to resource allocation to personnel management. Dr. Reeves nodded and made another note. Can you give me a specific example from your recent experience? Morrison thought about the mountain warfare training exercise he had presented earlier in the briefing. While the exercise had been successful overall, there had indeed been communication issues that had complicated certain aspects of the training. During our recent mountain warfare exercise, Morrison said, we experienced significant delays in receiving updated weather information because of communication protocols between different command levels. The delays didn't affect safety, but they did impact our ability to optimize training scenarios. Dr. Reeves looked up from her notepad. Who was responsible for those communication protocols? Morrison hesitated, realizing that Dr. Reeves' question was leading him into territory that could have implications for other officers and, possibly for command structures beyond his immediate experience. As an IG investigator, Dr. Reeves was undoubtedly interested in systematic issues rather than individual errors. The protocols involve multiple command levels, Morrison said carefully. Weather information flows through several different channels before reaching unit commanders in the field. Dr. Reeves made another note. And, in your experience, are these communication delays typical of how information flows through Marine Corps command structures? Morrison could see that Dr. Reeves was using his public confrontation about communication and protocol as an entry point for discussing larger systemic issues that were apparently the focus of her investigation. His assumption that she was a routine civilian observer had been wrong in ways that extended far beyond simple matters of identification and courtesy. Yes, ma'am, Morrison replied. Information delays are a common challenge, particularly when operations involve coordination between different commands or different services. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was listening to the conversation with obvious concern, and Morrison suspected that she was beginning to understand that Dr. Reeves' presence at the briefing was related to larger issues of command effectiveness and operational coordination. Dr. Reeves turned to address the room more broadly. I want to thank everyone for allowing me to observe today's briefing. What I've witnessed here provides valuable insight into communication patterns and expectations that are relevant to an ongoing Department of Defense assessment of information flow and command coordination. Colonel Stevens stepped forward from his position near the back of the room. Dr. Reeves, is this assessment related to specific operational concerns, or is it part of a broader organizational review? Dr. Reeves considered the question before responding. Colonel Stevens, I can tell you that the Department of Defense is conducting a comprehensive review of communication effectiveness across multiple commands and service branches. Today's briefing was selected as one of several observation points because it involves coordination between different Marine Corps units and command levels. Morrison felt a growing understanding that his confrontation with Dr. Reeves had inadvertently revealed exactly the kinds of communication and coordination issues that her investigation was designed to identify. His assumptions about her role, his reaction to her behavior, and the entire public confrontation had provided Dr. Reeves with a real-time demonstration of how information gaps could lead to conflict and misunderstanding. Major Rodriguez joined the conversation. Dr. Reeves, are there specific recommendations or changes that might result from this assessment? Dr. Reeves glanced at her notes before responding. Major Rodriguez, it would be premature for me to discuss specific recommendations. However, I can tell you that improving information flow and reducing communication gaps between different organizational levels is a priority for senior DoD leadership. Morrison realized that Dr. Reeves' apparent inattention during the briefing had actually been focused observation of communication patterns, information sharing, and coordination procedures. Her phone calls had likely been reports to senior investigators about what she was observing in real time. Dr. Reeves, Morrison said, I want to ask you something directly. Was my confrontation with you about protocol part of what you were here to observe? Dr. Reeves looked at Morrison with what might have been the beginning of a smile. Captain Morrison, your reaction to my presence and behavior provided exactly the kind of authentic data that makes observational assessment valuable. You demonstrated leadership initiative, concern for standards, and willingness to address problems directly. You also demonstrated how incomplete information can lead even experienced officers to make incorrect assumptions and inappropriate responses. The comment left Morrison feeling both vindicated and embarrassed. His principles about leadership and standards had been correct, but his application of those principles had been based on incomplete understanding of the situation he was trying to address. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward. Dr. Reeves, is there additional information that would help us better understand the context of your assessment? Dr. Reeves consulted her notepad before responding. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, I can share some general information that might provide useful context. The Department of Defense has identified communication effectiveness as a critical factor in operational readiness and mission success. This assessment is examining how information flows between different command levels, how personnel react to incomplete or unclear information, and how communication gaps affect decision-making and coordination. Captain Chen joined the discussion. Dr. Reeves, are there best practices or lessons learned from other commands that might help us improve our communication procedures? Dr. Reeves nodded approvingly at the question. Captain Chen, that's exactly the kind of proactive thinking that this assessment is designed to encourage. There are indeed emerging best practices from commands that have successfully addressed communication challenges. However, the most effective solutions tend to be those that are developed collaboratively between operational personnel and command leadership. Morrison listened to the evolving conversation with growing appreciation for the complexity of the issues that Dr. Reeves was investigating. His initial focus on individual protocol violations had been replaced by recognition that systematic communication challenges affected military effectiveness at every level. Dr. Reeves, Morrison said, I want to return to something you said earlier about my reaction providing authentic data. Are you suggesting that communication problems and misunderstandings are actually valuable information for your assessment? Dr. Reeves turned her attention back to Morrison. Captain Morrison, authentic reactions to real situations provide much more valuable data than theoretical discussions or planned exercises. Your willingness to confront what you perceived as inappropriate behavior demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership initiative that the Marine Corps values. The fact that your confrontation was based on incomplete information demonstrated exactly the kind of communication challenge that affects operational effectiveness. Morrison felt a complex mixture of relief and continued embarrassment. His actions had been both right and wrong simultaneously, reflecting principles that were sound but applied to a situation he hadn't fully understood. Colonel Stevens spoke up again. Dr. Reeves, what happens next in this assessment process? Dr. Reeves closed her notepad and returned it to her briefcase. Colonel Stevens, I'll be preparing a preliminary report based on today's observations and discussions. That report will be integrated with findings from similar assessments at other commands. The goal is to develop comprehensive recommendations for improving communication effectiveness across the Department of Defense. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes looked around the room at the assembled officers.
Dr. Reeves, is there anything specific that you would recommend for our command based on what you observed today?
Dr. Reeves stood and picked up her briefcase. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, I would recommend reviewing your procedures for informing personnel about the role and purpose of observers at official briefings. Captain Morrison's reaction might have been different if he had understood my position and purpose from the beginning. The recommendation was delivered without criticism, but Morrison could see its implications clearly. Better communication about Dr. Reeves' role would have prevented the entire confrontation and would have allowed the briefing to proceed without the disruption that his misunderstanding had created. Additionally, Dr. Reeves continued, I would recommend encouraging the kind of leadership initiative that Captain Morrison demonstrated, while ensuring that officers have access to complete information before they take action on perceived problems. Morrison appreciated Dr. Reeves' balanced assessment of his behavior, but he remained acutely aware that his confrontation with an IG investigator would likely follow him for some time in various forms of official documentation and informal discussion. Dr. Reeves moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to address the room. I want to thank all of you for your professionalism and your willingness to engage in productive discussion about communication effectiveness. The Marine Corps' commitment to excellence and continuous improvement is evident in how you've handled what could have been a difficult situation. Morrison watched Dr. Reeves prepare to leave, realizing that his encounter with her had been far more complex and significant than he had initially understood. What had begun as his attempt to enforce proper protocol had become a demonstration of both the strengths and weaknesses of military communication and leadership. The conference room remained unusually quiet for several minutes after Dr. Reeves departed. The officers who had witnessed the confrontation and its aftermath seemed to be processing the implications of what they had seen and heard. Morrison stood near the front of the room, acutely aware that his colleagues were likely reassessing both his judgment and the lessons that could be drawn from his encounter with the IG investigator. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was the first to break the silence. Let's take another 10-minute break before we continue with the remaining presentations, she announced. When we reconvene, I want to discuss some procedural improvements that might help us avoid similar communication issues in the future. As the officers began moving around the room and engaging in quiet conversations, Morrison found himself both isolated and the center of attention simultaneously. Several of his colleagues seemed uncertain about how to respond to what had occurred, while others appeared eager to discuss the implications of Dr. Reeves' investigation and Morrison's role in inadvertently revealing communication problems. Major Rodriguez approached Morrison first. Jim, he said, using Morrison's first name in a way that suggested both familiarity and concern, that was an interesting conversation. How are you feeling about how it played out? Morrison considered the question carefully. His initial anger and embarrassment had been replaced by a complex mixture of relief, continued concern about professional consequences, and genuine interest in the larger issues that Dr. Reeves had raised. Tom, Morrison replied, I'm still processing it all. On one hand, I feel like I did the right thing in addressing what I perceived as unprofessional behavior. On the other hand, I made assumptions that were completely wrong, and I potentially interfered with an important IG investigation. Rodriguez nodded. From where I was sitting, it looked like Dr. Reeves actually appreciated your directness once she understood your perspective. And her comments about leadership initiatives seemed genuinely positive. Captain Chen joined their conversation. What struck me most was how she used the entire situation as a teaching moment about communication effectiveness. She could have just pulled rank and shut down the discussion, but instead she turned it into exactly the kind of authentic assessment she was apparently looking for. Morrison appreciated his colleague's supportive observations, but he remained concerned about the potential long-term implications of his confrontation with a senior IG investigator. Military careers could be affected by much smaller incidents, and his public challenge of Dr. Reeves had been witnessed by multiple officers who would likely discuss and remember the incident for years. Colonel Stevens walked over to join the group. Morrison, he said in his characteristically direct manner, I've seen officers make much worse mistakes based on much less noble motivations. You stood up for standards and protocol, even when it was uncomfortable and potentially costly. That's exactly what we expect from Marine leaders. The comment from Stevens carried particular weight because of his reputation for demanding high standards and his willingness to criticize officers who failed to meet expectations. His endorsement of Morrison's actions, despite their problematic consequences, provided reassurance that at least some senior officers viewed the incident favorably. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes approached the group, her expression showing the kind of thoughtful concern that suggested she was still working through the implications of Dr. Reeves' visit and Morrison's confrontation. "Captain Morrison," Hayes said, "I want to discuss this situation with you privately after we finish today's briefing. But I also want to say publicly that I appreciate your commitment to maintaining standards, even when the situation became complicated." Morrison felt a measure of relief at Hayes' comment, but he remained aware that private discussions with senior officers after controversial incidents could lead in multiple directions, not all of them positive. As the break continued, Morrison found himself thinking about Dr. Reeves' questions regarding communication effectiveness and information flow. Her investigation was apparently focused on exactly the kinds of systematic problems that Morrison had experienced throughout his military career but had rarely discussed in formal settings. The mountain warfare training exercise that Morrison had presented earlier in the briefing had indeed been affected by communication delays and information gaps. Similar problems had affected other operations and training exercises throughout Morrison's experience, but he had typically addressed them as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of larger systematic issues. Dr. Reeves' perspective on communication effectiveness made Morrison reconsider many of the operational challenges he had encountered over the years. Equipment failures, coordination problems, resource allocation delays, and personnel conflicts had often been exacerbated by inadequate information sharing and unclear communication protocols. When the briefing reconvened, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes addressed the room with obvious intention to extract constructive lessons from the morning's events. "Before we continue with our remaining presentations," Hayes began, "I want to discuss what we learned from Dr. Reeves' visit and the communication issues that became apparent during her time with us." Hayes proceeded to outline several procedural improvements that would help ensure better information sharing about the role and purpose of observers at future briefings. She also discussed the importance of encouraging officers to address perceived problems while ensuring that they had access to complete information before taking action. Captain Morrison's response to what he perceived as inappropriate conduct demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership initiative that we value in Marine officers, Hayes said. The fact that his response was based on incomplete information demonstrates exactly the kind of communication challenge that affects operational effectiveness at every level. Morrison appreciated Hayes' balanced assessment, which echoed Dr. Reeves' earlier comments about the complex nature of his actions and their implications. The remaining presentations proceeded smoothly, but Morrison found his attention divided between the operational details being discussed and continued reflection on the larger issues that Dr. Reeves had raised. Communication effectiveness, information flow, and coordination challenges were clearly much more significant factors in military operations than he had previously considered. After the briefing concluded, Morrison remained in the conference room as requested by Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. The private conversation he had been anticipating took place in Hayes' office, where she provided additional context about Dr. Reeves' investigation and its potential implications. "Jim," Hayes said, "Dr. Reeves' assessment is part of a much larger Department of Defense initiative focused on improving operational effectiveness through better communication and coordination. Your encounter with her provided exactly the kind of authentic data that makes these assessments valuable." Hayes went on to explain that similar incidents at other commands had led to significant improvements in communication procedures and information sharing protocols. Morrison's willingness to confront perceived problems, despite the personal risk involved, was being viewed by senior leadership as evidence of the kind of proactive thinking that could drive positive organizational change. Furthermore, Hayes continued, "Dr. Reeves specifically mentioned that your response demonstrated the kind of leadership qualities that the Marine Corps needs to cultivate and support. She recommended that you be considered for advanced leadership training opportunities that focus on communication effectiveness and organizational improvement." The recommendation surprised Morrison, who had expected the conversation to focus on damage control and lessons learned rather than career development opportunities. Dr. Reeves' assessment had apparently identified positive leadership potential in his confrontational behavior, despite its problematic execution. Over the following weeks, Morrison received additional information about the Department of Defense assessment and its preliminary findings. Communication effectiveness had indeed been identified as a critical factor affecting operational readiness across multiple service branches. Commands that had successfully addressed communication challenges showed measurable improvements in mission success rates, personnel satisfaction, and resource efficiency. Morrison was eventually selected for a special assignment working with the IG office to help develop improved communication protocols based on lessons learned from the assessment. The assignment provided him with opportunities to apply his operational experience to systematic organizational improvements that could benefit military effectiveness across the Department of Defense. Looking back on his confrontation with Dr. Reeves, Morrison came to understand that his initial assumptions about authority, protocol, and appropriate conduct had been both right and wrong in ways that reflected larger truths about leadership and organizational effectiveness. Standing up for standards and addressing problems directly remained important leadership responsibilities, but doing so effectively required complete information and clear understanding of complex situations. The incident became a defining moment in Morrison's career, not because of the embarrassment or potential consequences he had initially feared, but because of the opportunities it created for him to contribute to meaningful organizational improvement. His willingness to challenge authority when he believed it was necessary had demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that senior leadership wanted to encourage and develop. Dr. Reeves had been right about the value of authentic reactions to real situations. Morrison's confrontation with her had provided genuine insight into communication challenges and leadership responses that could not have been captured through theoretical discussions or planned exercises. The incident had become a case study in how misunderstandings develop, how they can be addressed constructively, and how they can lead to positive organizational change. Morrison's experience taught him that effective leadership requires not only the courage to address problems directly but also the wisdom to ensure that interventions are based on complete understanding of complex situations. The balance between decisive action and careful analysis remained one of the most challenging aspects of military leadership, but it was also one of the most important factors in operational success and organizational effectiveness. Years later, when Morrison had achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel and was leading his own command, he would often share the story of his encounter with Dr. Reeves with junior officers facing similar leadership challenges. The lesson he emphasized was not about the importance of avoiding mistakes, but about the importance of learning from them and using them to drive continuous improvement in both personal leadership and organizational effectiveness. The Marine Corps' commitment to excellence, Morrison learned, was not about achieving perfection but about maintaining the courage and integrity to address problems directly, learn from experience, and contribute to the kind of organizational improvement that enhances mission success and protects the lives of the Marines who serve under capable leadership.